Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City of Casey Council meeting on the 21st of June 2022. My name's Nolene Duff and I'm the Chair of the Administrators. I'd like to start the meeting today with introductions of my colleague administrators, Mr Miguel Belmar.
Good afternoon.
And Mr Cameron. Sorry, I beg your pardon. And Mr Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And we also welcome our Chief Executive Officer, Mr Glenn Patterson, and we have a number of officers here with us this afternoon. Ms Jen Bednar, Director Customer and Business Transformation, Ms Colette McMahon, Director Community Life, Mr James Collins, Director City Planning and Infrastructure, and we have Jordan Barfoot and Tony McCausland in AV. We have Jacinta McLeod and Sharon Lozanne from our governance team, and a number of other officers here present, so welcome to everybody. I'd like to open the meeting with the statement of acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians on the land on which we work and live. The diversity statement. The City of Casey is home to remarkable diversity with many cultures, languages, faiths and community of worship, ages, LGBTQI+ identities and landscapes, together forming our rich and dynamic community story. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. I just have a couple of other items that I'd like to mention before we move into the formal part of the meeting this afternoon. And firstly, to note two members of the Casey community who were recognised in the Queen's Birthday 2022 honours list. Those being Mrs Dawn Dixon for services in a variety of roles and Mrs Elaine Duviston for services to softball and early childhood education. So it's lovely to see both of those residents of the City of Casey recognised for their work within the Casey community. So we thank them and acknowledge the recognition that they received in the Queen's Birthday Honours list. I'd also like to announce this afternoon that Council has unanimously determined to reappoint our Chief Executive Officer for a period of 5 years. I think it's important that the community understand that we have gone through a diligent process with the assistance of an independent chair through our CEO Employment and Remuneration Committee. And that process looked at the performance of Mr Patterson over his time here at the City of Casey, the work that he's undertaken and the ongoing commitment that he has made to the organisation. And with that, we determined as a panel of administrators that we were very supportive of his continuing in the role of Chief Executive Officer. I think the City of Casey is extremely lucky to have such an experienced executive as Mr Patterson. I think that we have observed the strong passion that Mr Patterson brings to his role as Chief Executive Officer, the recognition that he has within the organisation and the respect with which staff in the organisation hold him in such high esteem. And he has collected around him a very capable and skilled group of executives that together with him deliver what is a very big agenda for the City of Casey in one of the biggest and growing cities in our nation. So with that, on behalf of my colleagues, Mr Belmar and Mr Boardman, we strongly congratulate you. We're delighted that we're able to continue working with you and we thank you for the passion and commitment that you bring to the role as Chief Executive Officer for the City of Casey. So I think that's worth just perhaps a little round of applause. Congratulations. So now we'll move into the formal part of the meeting, and that's the confirmation of minutes, item 2. Is there a mover and a seconder to confirm the minutes of the council meeting held on the 17th of May 2022?
I'm happy to move those.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Mr Boardman. All in favour? Carried. Item 3, declaration of interests. I have considered my obligations under Section 130 of the Local Government Act 2020 and have no conflict to declare. Do any of my fellow administrators or council officers have any conflicts to declare with respect to this afternoon's agenda?
No conflict to declare. No, and likewise, Chair, nothing to declare.
So noted. Thank you. I now move to item 4, public question time, and there's been one public question submitted through Council's website for this afternoon's meeting, and that is submitted by Joby Petty, and the subject is the City of Casey marching at Pride 2023. The question specifically is, will Council, including the administrators, council officers and young people involved in council youth services, march in Midsummer Pride March next year behind a council banner? I can advise Joby Petty that Council has been very active in its work around the recognition, both actively and formally, of LGBTIQ+ communities, and we are currently developing an action plan, and that is really a very positive move from the City of Casey to ensure that there's an inclusion of diversity in all of the work that we do. So this work is being led by a reference group, a subcommittee of the Inclusive Communities group that operates within Council and does have representation from the LGBTIQ+ community. And the activities that will lead on from the action plan once it's developed and there is consultation with the community could include things like participation in the Midsummer Pride Festival. I can say that in the time that the panel have been here installed at the City of Casey since February 2020, there has been a much more inclusive approach to all members of our community, including people from the LGBTIQ+ community, and there's a strong commitment to ensuring that there is inclusion. We recently had raised the rainbow flag out the front, and that was a very positive day, hosted, emceed by Mr Cameron and all of us present. So I think there's certainly very strong recognition and a will and a wish to be inclusive. So certainly encourage Joby Petty for you to be in contact with officers should you wish to be more involved or etc. So thank you very much for raising the question. It's a very important question. I now move on to item 5, officer reports, and we have a number of reports all in open council this afternoon, and I'll start with item 5.1, Asset Plan 2022-2032, and I seek a mover and a seconder.
Chair, I'll move that report.
Thank you, Mr Boardman, and a seconder.
I'll second that.
Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, I invite you to speak to the item.
Chair, I am pleased to move the recommendation seeking the adaptation of the asset plan, the 10-year asset plan of the Council from 2022 to 2023, and we note the feedback that we've received from the community through quite a significant public exhibition period, and also we note that written responses will be provided to the community, particularly those submitters who have commented on the asset plan itself. This is a requirement under Section 92 of the Local Government Act. Although we have a statutory obligation to have a 10-year asset management plan, it is something that, from an administrative perspective, and echoing your words, Chair, around the leadership of the organisation from a CEO level specifically, but also from a director and also from the next level down, this is something which occupies some significant time and deliberation from us, because there are some significant challenges, particularly fiscal pressures that are not in any way responsive to the management of council. These are external factors which I'll touch on in a moment, but the overall starting principle in regards to this plan is to ensure that we get the right balance between operational expenditure, to ensure that maintenance and care and upkeep of community assets are proportional and as best representative for the needs of the community as possible, but also that we've got significant amounts of capital expenditure in our forward capital plans to allow for future investments in assets to meet community expectations, particularly as a large growth area council that we are. But I want to start by talking about the challenges that we are confronted with. And whilst the plan makes specific references to 6 challenges, which are in order: the infrastructure demands, so obviously what the community's expectations around from maintenance of assets and also their expectations around new assets; the renewal gap, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in the near future; certainly changes in infrastructure, so what may be considered, particularly as it relates to transport infrastructure in the past, may have different requirements under current planning requirements or under community expectations. There is undoubtedly technology improvements which will have an impact around how assets are designed, developed and maintained in the future. There are environmental and climate change requirements, both from a legislative perspective and also a practical and a community expectation perspective. And what I see as perhaps one of the most important challenges that we are confronted with is the funding system constraints. We currently operate, and we will be dealing with our 2022-2023 budget next week's special council meeting. We're operating in a rate cap environment, which is a legislative issue that the state government imposes upon us, but that does not take in consideration what is obviously inflationary pressures, changes in service and contract and capital financial arrangements by virtue of the cost increases and the labour shortages which are confronting many sectors in our stakeholder environment, and one that whilst we do have a renewal gap, which I've touched on and I'll talk about a little bit more detail in a moment, the reality is that whilst we continue to operate in this constrained funding environment, we do need to place very significant expectation and prudent financial management around new asset development and maintenance and renewal of current assets, because the money pit's not going to get any larger, but the challenges are going to undoubtedly increase, and that is a reality. And whilst I don't in any way want my comments to be interpreted as criticism of the rate cap, it is a statement of fact that there needs to be further evaluation on council finances, because it is not something that simply affects Casey. This is something that affects municipalities around the state and arguably around the country. So if I could talk about the plan briefly, noting that this is a very detailed analysis of our current requirements and our requirements 10 years post, but there are 3 categories that are in the plan, made up of civil infrastructure, which is 71%, building and facilities 21%, and open space recreation. And we have a number of classifications and assessment models that are used to determine what are those specific plans. They are listed within the plan on, if I could just find my spot on, I might come back to that actually, but they are listed insofar as the classification models that we use. But it does show that of the just over $3.5 billion worth of assets that we currently manage, there is an expectation that over the next 20 years, the council will require additional investments of $1.5 billion. And that incorporates an asset renewal target of 90% against depreciation, which goes to that point I've just made, is that the significant cost pressures on capital improvement to meet the growth expectations of the community vis-a-vis the requirements to keep maintaining these assets is something which council needs to consider very forthrightly, very extensively and significantly as it relates to future planning. So as I mentioned, and this is something that the community has noted, and it is worthwhile noting again this evening, that building facilities include sports and leisure, arts and cultural precincts, family community centres, community hubs, and of course public infrastructure such as public restrooms and so forth. That's roughly 21% of our infrastructure requirements. The civil infrastructure category includes roads, bridges, car parks, curbs and channels, past stormwater drainage systems, etc., and can include underground pits, pipes, culverts, water bodies and table drains. So that's basically what's required to make the municipality function, and these are to some extent underlooked and underappreciated assets, but making up 71% of our requirements, and with the growth area pressures, ensuring that all of those civil connectivity infrastructures expectations are met. That is a significant cost to council, not just from developments, but obviously from ongoing maintenance and upgrade. And the final category of open space recreation of 8% includes active and passive assets located within our reserves, such as sports ground, equipment, lights, fencing, vegetation, etc. So I just want to conclude by talking, Chair, which is, I think, a significant impact on future financial decision making within the organisation, and that is the issue regarding the renewal gap. That we have a target of a 5% per annum over the next 10 years. Having a renewal gap of 5% against a rate cap of 1.75 doesn't necessarily lend itself to a degree of economics and financial sensibility. There are going to have to be other ways of looking at particularly the capital program through state grants and other grants to ensure that there is supplementation and necessary investment in the future, and there is going to be undoubtedly a very difficult decision that we're going to have as an organisation around service contracts, particularly from an OPEX perspective, to maintain the asset renewal program and also the maintenance of existing assets under our current contractual arrangements. So whilst we do have a target which is reasonable to circumstances to ensure that the renewal gap does not in any way increase beyond 5% per annum, in the constrained and changing financial environment, it is going to be something that is going to have a lot more decision making attributed to it. So I do, Chair, flag that as something that we need to consider. I trust that the community has realised that the amount of work that has gone into this 10-year plan has taken consideration current expectations, future expectations, particularly amongst the challenging ecosystem that we have as being a growth area. As I remarked as a citizenship ceremony this morning, there were 67 new families that moved into Casey just last week, and that data is readily available on our website. That gives you an indication of not just the pressure but the expectation from the community to ensure that there is equity around the asset base from all levels of civil and community infrastructure and other service provisions, and one that I said is something in the future that we really need to make sure we have the right balance to meet that expectation. So I'm pleased to move the adaptation of the 10-year asset management plan. I'm very pleased with the community feedback and the consideration and the preparation that's gone into these documents, and I do so that whilst valuations and assessments in the plan were conducted in 2021, the economic and fiscal environment has changed dramatically. There will be ongoing and further revision to ensure that we can meet community expectations at every level.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. I'm reading the asset plan. What I want to reflect on in seconding this motion is the excellent work that was done in the community consultation, and in particular engaging the community in a discussion about the different options that a council like ours has in its asset planning. I note that the key theme that came through from that community consultation is really the concept of communication, and any asset planning of the nature that we're undertaking here, a 10-year plan, is one that will not be fixed in time. It will need to continue to respond to changing times, and at the moment, as Mr Boardman has identified, financial implications are ones that will impact heavily on our asset planning. But clearly the theme coming through from the community in our communication with them is that we need to continue to engage and communicate with them, and I think that message is heard loud and clear by us as administrators and also by the executive of this council. I know also that the community wants to see asset planning continue with a focus on activities such as walking tracks, sports centres, libraries, parks and assets of that nature. Ultimately, these are all things that are going to be constrained somewhat by our ability to fund them, but certainly by having a 10-year plan, we are best positioned to be able to provide the requisite assets and to maintain them to the requisite standard, noting the restrictions that we might face with respect to funding. So with those comments, Chair, and thanking those members of the community that have participated in the feedback, I'm happy to second this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And just to add to your comments around community engagement, I think this process was most interesting in that there was a deliberative process that included 22 community members over a 5-hour period with a significant input of information. And I was really quite fascinated with the conclusions and the feedback that they provided to us. Most notably, the challenges involved, as you've outlined, Mr. Boardman, and some of the comments that they made with respect to feedback about the session. And one of them that stood out for me was, and I quote from page 19 of the deliberative community engagement report, was it was evident that some community members expect council to repair, maintain and expend on absolutely everything that goes wrong. I think we feel that in a local government context, but the further comment that this individual made as a participant in that process was what a great couple of weeks it was that gave them great insight into the City of Casey and particularly the decision-making processes that are quite complex around asset management and the challenges that we face. So thank you to those participants for their involvement and their dedication to work through 2 evenings of a few hours each. It's quite a big commitment. So with that, I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.2 is the Q3 Community Report. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I'll move this.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and a seconder.
Seconder, Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. This Q3 report covers the period from January to March of this year, and in reading the report, I'm happy to report that we are starting to see a reawakening, a re-emergence of the continuing activities of Council with respect to the use of our facilities. I note that over the summer we were able to attract sporting events to our facilities, that we had the facilities used by both sporting clubs within the community, but also by some of our tenants, including Melbourne Storm and AFL clubs, who were able to use facilities to play practice matches and the like. And it's fantastic to see those facilities being used by professional athletes and for the community to then be able to use those facilities or facilities nearby, which are maintained to a very high standard over the summer. I also note that with respect to the work that's been done by council officers with respect to our advocacy, that the summer period was the one where important work was done in planning council's participation, or council's campaign, if I can use that expression, for the election that occurred a month ago. So the community can be assured that there was a significant thought went into the advocacy program that council undertook during that time, and as administrators we participated in some of those activities to the extent that we were able to. Finally, I note also, and I won't say too much today because next week we are talking about the budget, that Council's financial position remains one that requires, obviously, attention with an eye to the fact that we are still living the realities of COVID impact, and mindful of the fact that that will have an ongoing impact on, in particular, the delivery of some capital works and the ability we have to be able to deliver them in the long term, and we'll have more to say about that in the future. But I do note that in this plan, the capital works highlights included the Lockhaven Open Space Reserve in the Lockhaven Estate in Cranbourne West, and also the Clyde Recreation Reserve in Elliston Estate Clyde, which we were able to visit last week, in fact, and see the development of that site and the important principles used in the development of that site, including that the site is being used for multiple ovals and multiple sport, and the environmentally sustainable principles used in the development of that site. So with those comments, Chair, I'm happy to move this report, to encourage the community to download it, to read it. It is packed full of information, and as usual, I want to thank the officers who have worked on this report in preparing a very high quality piece of work. And with those comments, I'm happy to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr Belmar, for your comments. This is one of the more critical and transparent reporting mechanisms we have here at Casey to communicate to the community our performance, not just against the action plan and all the strategic indicators that exist within the action plan, but the capital result, the financial performance, and we do note that the new additions include contracts awarded over $5 million and an update to the Municipal Monitor's report, which is a standing agenda item of this particular reporting. And as Mr Belmar has articulated, there are a number of highlights in the report. There is a number of good stories, irrespective that the reporting period was coinciding with just as we were coming out of the final tranche of COVID restrictions to an extent, and the number of challenges that were legacy-based because of the events of 2020 and 2021 are obvious, but nonetheless we believe that the performance of the municipality and the organisation as a whole has been impressive and has met community expectations as best as we possibly can, albeit that we note quite openly that there is still further work to do. And the reason why we can say that with a degree of confidence is that as part of the quarterly reporting framework, as we do undertake our community satisfaction survey, and the criteria that is used to determine the community responses includes the overall performance, direction, customer service, state of local roads, community decisions, consultation, engagement, lobbying and trust in council. And we note with a degree of pride that the trust in council for this quarter is slightly up, and that hopefully is indication of the direction that we self as administrators and the governance, and I'd like to think the professionalism that we have embarked and demonstrated as being in this role has been reflected by the community. But we do note that there are some challenges within some sectors of the community regarding the overall performance, and from an administrator's perspective we have noted that quite significantly from a very localised and geographic perspective, and we are dealing through that through a heightened level of community engagement to better understand those issues and to be in a position to better respond to those issues. I think it's also worth noting, Chair, that indicators such as customer service and also the overall direction, which is probably somewhat different from the overall performance, have increased significantly, and that again shows that there is an understanding of our level of engagement with the community, and there is that increasing level of satisfaction, which we hope is not just a once-off. We hope that this is something that is reflected through a sustainable basis. But from our perspective as administrators, we take this level of community engagement and feedback as one of the critical indicators of our performance, and it is reflected and considered into all of our decision making, and that we can be as transparent as possible to provide the clearest and most open picture of the operations and the health and otherwise of the organisation as a whole. That is a very important function that we do undertake with a very deep sense of commitment. So with those comments, I echo the words of my colleague Mr Belmar and thank the community for their ongoing feedback to us, and trust that will continue into the future and will provide further information to inform our future decision making.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.3, Section 11A, Instrument of Authorization, Planning and Environment Act 1987. Do I have a mover?
Yes, I'll move this.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. This is a procedural motion in every respect that is required to be moved to ensure that the appropriate officers hold the necessary powers and delegations under the Planning and Environment Act, and that they hold the correct instruments to be able to exercise those powers. I have considered the document and am happy to move the motion. I also note, Chair, and I've not spoken on this topic before, but I note that at every council meeting we read a diversity statement, and it is obvious from reading this instrument of appointment authorisation that this council clearly reflects the diversity in our community, that this is a council that reflects the broad diversity and experience that a community like Casey has, and I am heartened by it, and I congratulate those members of staff who are being who are represented in this instrument of appointment authorisation this evening, and reflect again on this document sometimes being considered one that is purely a procedural document, but again, just reading it again and reflecting it again on it again, it's an important document that shows the kind of council we are. And with those comments, I'm happy to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, anything to add?
Chair, very quickly, I think the comments by Mr Belmar around the staffing list with the organisation reflecting the diversity of the KC community itself are very, very well made, and I think that's a very strong point to note, and it also shows that the specialist skills, the size of the organisation, the workload of the organisation being a significant growth area is reflected upon the number of staff that we have by virtue of their various classes. And I think it goes without saying, Chair, that whilst we have acknowledged the performance of the CEO and the broader executive, we acknowledge the performance of every member of staff within the organisation. We know the challenges associated with meeting community expectations, but running out a very dedicated community service program, capital works program, and all of the internal administrative requirements. We do have a very strong and committed group of individuals within the organisation, and we do thank them for their services, not just to the organisation, but the KC community as a whole. So I'm happy to second the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. And the final item this afternoon is item 5.4, debt management sundry debtors. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
I'll move that, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Boardman, and a seconder.
I'll second that.
Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman?
Chair, I note that this is a statutory requirement, and there is a recommendation that $13,703.36 of debtor balance owed to the City of Casey be written off by management. That is consistent and in accordance with our debt management policy. I have to say that whilst we undertake our duties, particularly as it relates to dealing with any issues of hardship or financial pressure from any member of the community from a very principled and very fair basis, this also applies to our debt management policy. And for an organisation of this size, with a budget of the magnitude of what we will be discussing next week, to go through such an extensive exercise where we are writing off just shy of $14,000 worth of debt shows that those principles have been applied, that there has been arrangements made with a number of members of the community to deal with any obligations that they have to the organisation fairly and equitably, and that the reasons and the rationale for the write-offs, as clearly presented in Table 3, are not just appropriate in the circumstances, but they do show that every effort has been made to make contact to seek any degree of restitution as applicable, but to do it under a framework where there was no party, whether ourselves or the organisation, unfairly or adversely disadvantaged. And whilst we need to be ensured that we maintain strong fiscal prudence around all of our obligations at every single level, there are some times where this policy needs to be applied, and that those occurrences have been transparently communicated to the community and applied under the framework, and one which is appropriate in the circumstances. So I just note that the definition of sundry debtors for the purposes of this report are not statutory, i.e. rate-based debts. These are fees, charges, invoices for a broad range of purposes such as kindergarten fees, rental and room hire, repairs, ticket sales for events, etc. So it is a very small amount where every effort has been made to try and ensure that those debts were collected and completed in the circumstances. As I said, Chair, for the reasons articulated in the report, that has not been the case, and we do need to apply the write-off policy consistent with our overall framework.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair, and I endorse the comments of Mr Boardman, and also note that relating to the application by Council of its hardship policy, that the largest write-off that we are that has been recommended to us to write off, in fact, relates to a hardship matter, and that the average amount of a debt that we're writing off are smaller amounts that relate to figures in the hundreds, and in fact $263 being an average. And for a council of this size, with the size of business that is undertaking, that is operated, it's a credit to the officers who are involved in doing this work, that they're able to pursue the debts, and who are able to, in a, if I can use the expression, in a compassionate way, provide us with advice to write off the appropriate debts. And with those comments, I am happy to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. I now put that motion to the vote. Carried unanimously. That concludes our officer reports this afternoon. I will move to item 6, consideration of reports of committees, and I simply note the record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers, and that will be received and noted. Item 7, petitions. There are no petitions for this afternoon's meeting. Item 8, no urgent business for this afternoon's meeting. And so that brings me to item 9, which is to formally close the meeting and thank those of you that have watched the live stream this afternoon. Good afternoon.